On May 25th in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd died at the hands of a police officer. Police were responding to a call from a shopkeeper about somebody trying to pass a potential counterfeit bill. They arrested Floyd. The surveillance video shows a compliant man being led away in handcuffs. The cell phone video shows a white police officer kneeling on Floyd's neck for 7 minutes despite protests from onlookers that his life is in jeopardy. Floyd repeatedly says, "I can't breathe," and then, "I'm about to die." When the officer eventually removes his knee, Floyd's body is limp and unresponsive. A person nearby can be heard saying, "They just killed him." Floyd was taken to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. A police statement said that Floyd appeared to be in medical distress, but made no mention of him being pinned to the ground with the weight of a police officer compressing his airway. This video of Floyd's death is horrific but not surprising. Terrible but not unusual. It depicts a kind of incident that is periodically reenacted in North America all the time. The officer, Derek Chauvin, was taken into custody 4 days later on May 29th. According to the Minneapolis Department of Public Safety, he was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. A few days later, on June 3rd, it was upgraded to second-degree murder. The 3 other officers involved in the incident were charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder and aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter. George Floyd's death has sparked global soul-searching as protests break out across many nations. It's drawn attention to the treatment of African Americans by police and the justice system. Today on the show, I'm speaking with a longtime friend and client, Brian Curry, about his experiences with racism growing up here in Canada and throughout his travels.
This is Performance Theory with Mike Clark.
Brian, thanks for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me.
If you can just give us a little bit of your background and how, I guess, your experience with Canadians versus the U.S., and is racism as bad in Canada as it is in the U.S., or is it just different?
Yeah. So I've worked for quite a few different companies, kind of in the public-facing sphere. Kind of in management and sales. I've worked for American companies, worked for Canadian companies, worked for European companies. So I've traveled quite a bit around the globe with my jobs, and so I spent a lot of time in the United States. So I have some unique perspectives from that. I also have some unique perspectives from how I grew up. I grew up. I'm biracial. I was raised mostly by my mom, who's white, and my older siblings are white. And, it's a really interesting situation when we dive into it, where I had some, identity issues of kind of figuring out who I am, where, kind of the outside world was already kind of labeling me and telling me who I am. So kind of when I grew up and kind of dealing with that, I came to a good spot now of who I am, but definitely there's always the outside world in the racism, which has been a big issue, especially now. And now people are starting to come to realize like how serious it is for people of color and Black people and Indigenous communities. So,
quite honestly, I was a little sheltered from this, and it's not that I didn't grow up around any other races. It's a lot of my family is other races, so growing up, it wasn't a big deal. They were a person. But because I guess I looked at it that way, I didn't see all the other things that were happening and that have happened. And so I'll admit one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview is because I know myself, I think I'm a little blinded to what's actually out there. And I really wanted to get a better perspective on the things that, somebody like me doesn't see.
Yeah. And, I kind of like to break out, whatever you want to call it, bias, prejudice, racism. I kind of break it out into three different things. That I see it as like kind of the straight out racism where, people have this belief that they are better than someone because of something, and that turns into, depriving a group of freedom, of something, of things that they should be able to do. And then the other part is the systemic racism, which is, things you hear that a lot in the media now. And, I'd probably like to go a little bit into like, kind of what that means. And systemic racism, I think the biggest issue for people is kind of how police action transpires between the races and kind of hiring practices and kind of just the overall lack of diversity. And then the other aspect is what people call microaggressions, which are, things that to someone who's not aware of it just says, oh, well, it's harmless, right? But to the person who's experiencing it, it's something that they're experiencing every day. And it kind of just perpetuates that idea of otherism, or the idea that you're different than someone else, where you're not really, right?
Yeah. I guess one of my, one of my really good friends, Daryl, he's black. He's down in the U.S. His wife is white, and I'm just going to read what she posts on her Facebook, and this is a really good perspective from her part. She said, my husband and I are teammates in every sense of the world, and we know that although we live together, we live in very different worlds because of the color of our skin. I drive fast, he drives slow. I don't get pulled over much, and when I do, my initial feeling is to think of how I can get away with just a warning. He gets pulled over more often, never because of something he did, with no choice but to feel fear. He shows up to a neighborhood meeting so that people will recognize him when he's out for a run late at night or early in the morning. I don't have to worry about running in my neighborhood. He feels most comfortable when traveling in a suit and tie, me, leggings and a sweatshirt. I don't always follow the rules, and he always follows the rules to the T. And then she goes on and on and on about that, but it just shows a huge difference of how, I guess, my friend has to be aware of every single surrounding, whereas some other people just go ahead with their life.
Yeah. And, that's a really powerful post. I mean, my mom described it, she told me, very early on that, I was like 5 or 6 when she told me this, but she said, because of your color, there's going to be people who treat you differently. There are going to be situations where you're going to have to work really hard and you may not get noticed. And, this is coming from a woman who grew up in the 60s, and she was right at the, right at the forefront of some of this stuff going on, like within her own family. So, it's kind of that, the talk, they always talk about, black and brown parents giving their kid the talk. I was lucky enough. I didn't have to get to talk about, if you get pulled over, you may get killed, but I definitely got to talk to the extent of, people are just going to straight up treat you differently, and you're going to have to be able to grow a thick skin, and you're going to have to be able to, turn the other cheek constantly, or you're going to get punished. So it's definitely something that I had to take with for my whole life. And it's something that I'm always cognizant of with my interactions with people.
So in all your travels for work, have you noticed a massive difference between how people get treated in Canada versus the U.S.?
There is a difference. I wouldn't say it's better. It's different. It's a really interesting question. It's a good question. Sorry, a lot of the talk in Canada is it's not as bad in Canada, and in many respects, of course, it's not as bad. But in many respects, it's very similar.
I heard it being called polite racism.
Yeah, that would be kind of how I would label it. So I worked for an American company for a long time. I spent a lot of time in the United States. And, in some cases I felt more at home when I was in the United States, and this is because it was a little bit more diverse, with people that look like me.
Yeah.
Right. And I think sometimes people in Canada can't truly appreciate what it's like to be around people that look like you, and kind of there's that comfort that you can't really speak of, and that's why you see a lot of communities in Canada that, you have a lot of culturalized communities where there's a lot of, say Sikh people that live kind of all close together, or, people from China all living close together. And it's because there's that inherent safety within your own community. And I think sometimes it's lost for Canadians that, of course, we're a multicultural country, but, when you're the one that stick out, you're the Waldo in the group of people, like, that doesn't go unnoticed by that person. That person still feels that otherism with them. So, but with that being said, people are, very good in a lot of respects. So, I don't want to say it's the worst thing or it's terrible, but there's definitely, areas of improvement that people can kind of look in the mirror and deal with. But getting back to your point about, the different, my time in the United States, I feel in Canada, at least anecdotally, because I've also been all over the country with my work, and there are regions that I feel that are a little bit more prejudiced than others, and prejudiced to certain groups than others. But it's not explicit, it's kind of that indifference. They give you that indifference. I would say that would be the best way to describe it.
It must be hard to hear a lot of those things that, like, I don't know how much you've been harassed, but I know that one of the times that I guess I could say that it really stood out to me was the first time I went down to Texas. I went down there and I was in the IHOP, and of course the majority of the patrons there are white. All the servers are black, and there was a good old cowboy sitting at a table. He's probably about 70 years old, and he snapped his fingers, said the N-word really loud, and said, "Come over here." Yeah. And like, I wish I had a picture of my face, because my mouth dropped open, and honest to God, I think that's the first time I've actually heard that word being said out in public, and like no one batted an eye.
Yeah. The first time I was called that word was when I was 4. So
wow.
It happened pretty early.
Oh.
I was it was actually one of somebody in the neighborhood said that about me to my brother. So my brother had to ask my mom like what that word meant, because he was 10 or so at the time.
Yeah.
So then she had to explain to him, and then that was, I think, leading up to when she gave me the talk. I think that was pretty quickly after that. But I mean, like when I talk about like, the straight out racism, also there was that situation, and there was others. It's weird. It's sometimes you're shocked that it's said, and you're right. You get that like mouth like to the floor type situation. There was a time probably 8-9 years ago, I was going to a bar, and it was like Canada Day, and I was like dressed out all in red. So I was like, I'm pretty patriotic, and then somebody, this car of like 4 people, like said, "Go back to Somalia," like just completely random. Like it was on White Ave, like just completely random comment. And I was like, just completely shocked. So I'm like, is that what they really said to me? Like, I mean, I'm not Somalian, but like, even if I was, like, what's the point in that? Like someone's, what was going through their mind when they thought of that, right?
Yeah.
There was another time where I was on the highway, and there was like 4 people on motorcycles, and I guess I was driving, too slow for them, but they passed me on the left lane, and they said, "Get out of the way, you effing N-word," right? And this was about 8 years ago. This is in, where we live in Edmonton.
Yeah. So 8 years ago is like still very, very recent.
Yeah. So it's one of those like random things where it's like, you don't even know it's coming. And, and for, a lot of people in the front-facing industries, like, servers or bartenders and stuff, right? They, unfortunately, both the United States and Canada, they kind of have to get used to that or expect that it's happening. But for someone like me who's not really in that, industry, it happens rarely. But like when it does, it's just like completely out of nowhere.
How were your brothers and how was your family growing up? Like, if somebody said something like that to you, did they defend you? Was it did they go after them?
Other than that situation, typically it never really came up from that point. Kind of like within my own household, there was a little bit of a bubble because I had I had 4 older siblings. They were very protective of me, but we never really we never got into that position to kind of experience that. It was more of the, like I said, the microaggressions. And it was, so kind of how I describe microaggressions, it's stuff that just kind of puts you in your place, like when a random person, and I mean, you remember this, I used to have a massive afro or I'd get cornrows or whatever, right? And random people on the street would walk up to you and say, "Can I touch your hair?" Completely inappropriate. But because they have kind of slotted me in as an other, it's something unique or something that should be, gawked at. It's, oh, I should be able to touch your hair. They asked permission, I guess you can say, to give them some credit. But I mean, think of it this way. If a black person or just say another white person walked up to someone randomly and said, "Hey, can I pet you on the head?" What would the look, and that's why I like to tell people with these microaggressions, it's like reverse the role and see how you would react and just try to think of where you would react to that. The other common one would be, where are you from? And to a black person, that is something that, which had to get used to answering time and time again.
Which is so odd to me because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're from a different country. I mean, you got to take a look at a lot of the immigrants coming into Canada now. They're all white or, various shades, but a lot of them are white. If you were to line up a lot of the immigrants, there's no way you can tell what country they're from or if they're born and raised here or not.
Yeah. And that's where I get the where you're from comment, after a while it really clicked for me where it's racism at its core, when you take everything away, it really comes down to someone having a prejudice against skin color. It has nothing else to do with anything other than skin color. And when you think of it from that perspective, it's pretty stupid. Yeah. It's where are you from? It's what? Well, I'm from Winnipeg. I mean, I'm from Alberta. What does it matter? No. Where are you from? Right?
Yeah.
And like I said, when you put yourself into the other person's shoe, it's if someone kept pressing you of where are you from to a white person, they would have no idea. I'm from Edmonton. Yeah. And they're no. Where are you from? So they're assuming that I'm other. I'm somewhere not Canadian. And I always find it funny, especially for me, and everyone has their own different experiences, but from my mom's side, we've traced my mom's side of the family back to the 1830s. We emigrated to Canada in 1830s. So in a lot of situations, if you want to put it one way, I'm more Canadian than you asking,
Yeah.
And once again, it goes back to just how stupid it really is. I've been in Canada my family's been in Canada, one half of it, for almost 200 years. So this whole otherism of where are you from? It shouldn't matter, but it does to some people.
Yeah. And to me, it's kind of stupid. It doesn't matter. If you came from wherever, who cares? You're here now.
Exactly. and then you get the other comments of like, oh, you don't really have an accent. It's like, yes, because I was born in Canada. my family have been in Canada for 200 years. Like, right?
We lost the accent, around 1835.
Yeah, exactly. So, it just shows you that there really isn't anything different, but it's, of course there's cultural elements, but I mean, when you look at, like, say 100 years ago, people were racist against Irish people and Italians and Irish immigrants were treated terribly. And, now in some cases it's just a matter of, you need to find a new victim,
Mm-hmm.
And now we're starting to realize it's like, people have been hard on the Indigenous community. People have been hard on the Black community. What can we do to make this better? So, I'm hopeful that this is kind of like at least the start of something positive, but, a lot of these things need to be aired out, and people need to kind of say their truth and say their piece. And I'm all for it,
One of the things that I heard recently is like, they're going to mandate this legislation, that legislation. And to me, that doesn't really it's a step in the right direction, but really those peoples who are causing this all to happen, they need to change, not the legislation as much, because if you can change the legislation all you want, if that person has a shitty attitude and he or she is racist, that's not going to change by changing the legislation. I think
you're right.
I think you need more education, and I honestly don't know at what time, like at what point in a person's life do they start becoming racist? Is it driven by more of their family life? Because I know, like, my daughter, she's going to be going into grade 3. She's got a lot of her dance friends. And I think her and like maybe one or two of her other friends are the only white ones in there. And the rest of them, there's Asian, Black, Mexican. There is a ton of different cultures. And I haven't once heard her ever make any comment about the color of the skin. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's like everybody's just the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have a almost exact same story with my niece. She's in grade 5, and she was having problems with a girl in her daycare, and my sister was like, okay, who is it? And she's like, well, she was describing her, like, oh, she has black hair, brown eyes, and like she was describing her, oh, she wears this type of clothes or whatever. And my sister, like, after like a couple of weeks, she still couldn't get like who she was describing. And then when she went to the daycare, she pointed out, and it just so happened to be a Black girl, and she had never one point said that she was Black. She was just like another girl with black hair. Like, it was completely like, she's like, okay, I mean, if she said it was a Black girl, that would have pretty much narrowed it down, but like, it just wasn't in her vocabulary. Cause it's just another girl. Right.
I wonder how much of it actually has to do with the schooling and the education system. Because quite honestly, I know down in the U.S. they have, Black History Month, but I think, up here, a lot of history gets kind of pushed aside. I mean, we learn the major stuff, but, what grade is it that you learn that all the atrocities that Canada did to the Japanese and the Chinese, in World War II? When do you find that out? That's kind of like the last half of grade 12 that you find out, oh, Canada wasn't actually that nice to these people. And then I don't know if it's changed since, if they talk more about Indigenous culture and, all the things that Canadians did to them as we were establishing the country, or, anything to do with Blacks in and history in Canada. I think that kind of gets washed over a lot.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I'm also I'm not in education right now, and I've heard that it's changing a little bit, but I mean, it comes a point where, especially like the residential schools and how Indigenous communities were treated in Canada. I mean, some of it is pretty abhorrent, right? So when's the right time to talk about that, right? When is it traumatizing or not traumatizing for a kid? And we don't really know. I mean, I trust educators kind of know, but there's also that parent pushback. There could be that parent pushback where it's like, this is a little bit too much for, my son or daughter. Because I think that's, and you hear about that, like sex education, for example, right? Where they push back and say, you shouldn't be teaching my kid that early. Now, I don't want to wade into that argument, but I mean, when you talk about like some of the racist history of Canada, are they really talking about it? And I don't know. I mean, but from your point about the legislation and stuff, I think that's really important, because I mean, how do you change what's in someone's heart? And the answer is it's pretty much impossible. But I mean, maybe, I don't want to say that everyone's a lost cause that are racist, but it's tough. And I agree with you. You can't just legislate it away, racism away. But I think what the goal of some people are trying to get rid of that systemic racism. For example, like, there's a lot of research to say that when people are hiring people, they discriminate based on the name on the resume. Like it's fact that people look at the names and they may be doing it subconsciously. That's what I mean. It's not straight out racism. It's like you look at 5 names and one name has an ethnic sounding name and you say, well, you kind of justify it. And then, there's obviously further discrimination based on, schools and obviously your companies, previous companies. So, is that racism? I think a good argument can be made that yes, it's systemic racism, because you're depriving someone of an opportunity. So when you talk about like how do you fix that? Well, maybe you don't legislate it, but maybe a company puts in practices like the hiring manager gets a bunch of resumes without names. It's something simple. It's not something that has to be like the whole society has to be burned down to fix. There's a lot of things that people can do if they just have the courage to say, hey, you know what, I might have a bias. Let's see if I can fix that,
And I think that's where education comes into play. So even outside of like the traditional school system, if somebody my age, obviously, you know what, I can never understand the position that you or anybody else is in. So what can I do? So that's educate myself as much as possible on how to avoid being racist, avoid stupid comments, I guess, would be another thing. Because I know a lot of comments come out of people's mouths. And, I worked in the bar for a long, long time, and people will say a comment, and it's not meant to be racist, but it comes out, and you're just, I'd be standing there a couple times, and they say stuff to either you or any of the other staff members, and I'm like, good Lord. Like, I realize you got a couple drinks in you, and you didn't mean any harm, but holy crap, where did that come from? Like, that it's completely inappropriate.
Yeah. Well, like asking to touch my afro. Like, no, I don't want you to touch my afro, right? Or saying, oh, I have a black friend, or calling a bunch of black people a bunch of thugs, right? I mean, like, there's some really definite racial undertones when you call some black people thugs. I mean, maybe there's that person out there that calls white people, Asian people, black people all thugs, right? And that's fair. Maybe they don't. Maybe that's the best thing that can come out of their mouth that describes that situation. I'm not saying they're racist, but you have to take a step back sometimes and say, hey, is that word I'm using could be perceived, and maybe just give it a little bit of a second thought. Like, we don't obviously want to control every word, or anybody should, no one should be controlled what they say, but there's also that, realization is, hey, obviously this offends some people, and maybe I might be perceived as being something I'm not because I don't feel that way. So maybe I'll dial that back a little bit, and that's kind of where, that self-awareness, like you said, where it's just like, take a step back, read a book, read an article, talk to someone, and recalibrate what you're saying.
How effective do you think these protests are? Do you think they're good for creating awareness, or can they lead to other things that, once again, throw a negative light on the situation?
I mean, that's the $1 trillion question. When you talk about how much Canada and the United States and other countries spend on collectively on policing. I mean, that's the real big question. I mean, I think the easy thing and we've seen that, and I've been very careful with what I've been saying recently, kind of in that political spectrum, because I really think it would do the movement a disservice to make it like a left versus right thing. Yeah. I think it should be just a human thing. So, and I know, once again, being careful, I mean, there are some people on the right that really, bring up of like, oh, well, there's a violent protest or there's a violence in there. I mean, yeah, there is some violence there, and that shouldn't happen. But, maybe, is it part of the movement, or is it, opportunist, is it anarchist, whatever. And then people on the left that are just saying, anything goes. I mean, we're mad and everything, right? I mean, there has to be some control. There has to be some balance in that. But, like I said, I've been very careful with trying to frame things I've said, especially like, on Facebook, and, you probably saw what I posted on Facebook.
Yes, I did.
Which kind of led to this conversation was, I wanted to really say it as like, there are some personal responsibility regardless of your opinion. It's like, to take a step back and say, what can you personally do to make this better? And if everyone was willing to do that, that would fix a lot of the problems. And I think that's what these protests are for, is they're really just saying, okay, everyone needs to be aware of like what we're truly going through. And I think it was a flashpoint to actually see, it's like, oh, well, it can't be that bad. Or it's just a couple bad apples, or it rarely happens. It's like, we saw a man get killed on tape. Like, people need to like look and listen and start learning,
Yeah, I can't honestly, and the media keeps playing that tape over and over and over again, and I don't know if that's doing the movement better or worse. Like, not even necessarily the movement, but just humans. Like,
yeah,
a couple of years ago, like when I was growing up, I can't remember what the show is. Is it Blade Runner or something like that? And
yeah.
People are getting killed on TV, and I remember watching the movie, and I'm like, yeah, I don't think we're ever going to see somebody lose their life on TV. Like, that seems so distant to me. And now the way the media portrays things, or just, I guess they don't have a real censor. They will show that, and regardless of whether the person's white, black, purple, whatever, they're showing somebody get murdered on TV.
Yeah, and it's crazy. I mean, like I said, I think there's a certain extent of like kind of shock value, shocking people into like, this is serious,
It did need to get out there, though, definitely, because otherwise, you hear about things in the news and you go, oh, yeah, this guy's okay. Yeah, so he got stepped on the neck and this and that. But when you see the video and you see the person's eyes and they're screaming for help, that's different than reading a headline.
Well, yeah, and what's funny is like, I mean, I guess it was the idea of looking someone in the eyes. But, I mean, there's videos out there. There's been videos out for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, Eric Garner, the gentleman who was running away from the police and got shot in the back. Like, there are videos out there, and I'm not 100% sure why this struck a nerve versus all the other videos out there, but there's a mountain of evidence to say that there is a systemic problem.
Maybe
unfortunately, this gentleman had to lose his life for people to get that. But I mean, it happened, and here we are.
Maybe, one of the top things off my head would be maybe because some of the other ones, it seems so far gone to somebody to get shot by the police. But for somebody to lay their hands on you or their knee and actually kill you with their own body. There's no weapon involved. I think that is dramatically more impactful than, somebody got shot. That's a quick, I guess it's because a gun is a quick decision. Yeah. Sticking your knee on somebody's neck for 9 minutes, that's intentional.
Yeah. And that's what these protests are trying to, I like to see it as like the media, you do you, and, we do what we got to do. And the media is going to do the loop. They're going to sensationalize, violent protests. They're going to sensationalize a lot of things back and forth. But, behind all these protests, there's some really good, in the United States and Canada, organized groups that are pushing behind the scenes for change. And you're seeing that where with Minneapolis, they said, you know what, we're going to tear it down. We're going to tear down the police department. We're going to fund it. We're going to start all over again. Camden, New Jersey did the same thing, and they tore it all down and they rebuilt it, and it's a lot better. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better. And that's what, a lot of this thing, the systemic racism, that's what these groups are trying to do, is to try to snuff it out. And sometimes you got to tear it down, or sometimes you got to change it. I think in Canada, we're in a little bit of a better situation. It's not perfect, but it's a little bit better. You may not have to tear everything down. You have to make some changes. But in the United States, there's some police departments that need to be completely rebuilt.
I think it also comes down to training because, just thinking off the top of my head once again, is that, if you compare the police force to somebody like an air traffic controller, air traffic controller has to have control of their emotions 100% of the time. They cannot break. In fact, I know a couple of people who are air traffic controllers, and outside of just the training on the screen, to get into the program, the amount of stress tests you do, the amount of mental tests that you do, that you're not going to get stressed out and crack in pressure situations is remarkable. And I don't think they do that for police. And like, I don't know if you've ever watched live PD. I've seen guys punch cops straight in the face and the cop doesn't do anything and just calmly puts a guy in handcuffs. And that's what you want. Well, ideally you don't get punched in the face, but you want somebody who's not going to react when, I guess, react violently when somebody does something. They react with appropriate force, not over force. And, getting punched in the face, obviously, like my first response would be to want to punch. I don't care who they are. You get punched in the face. You want to punch them back. But in that position, you can't. You have to have control over your emotions the entire time. And maybe that's something that the police force has to look into, is more mental stress tests of like, are you mentally strong enough to be able to keep your composure at the most stressful times?
Oh yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, sometimes there are the police systems that are too corrupt to fix. But when you look at it from like on the streets, like cop to cop, the training needs to get better. You need to try to get that unconscious bias, get it out in the open, and make people like realize, okay, how am I going to react to this? And you're right. I mean, there's been a kind of that movement towards, while the cop, he had to make a split second decision, we'll give him a pass, right? And there's only so many times you can use that as a reason before you start seeing protests like you see now, right? And it's not just about, George Floyd. It's about all the other people of color that have been killed by the police. And you could fix a good chunk of that by, better training. You can fix a lot of that by defunding the police and rebuilding some systems. I mean, when they talk about defunding the police, I had this conversation with someone before, and they were like, well, how is that going to happen? There was a police service, I can't remember which one, but they're basically saying that 30% of their calls are essentially social work calls, mental health checks. So when you talk about like police Are we going to need police? Yes, of course. You just can't like abolish the police. There are some radicals that believe that, but when you talk about like, what is, doable or what's achievable, you're talking about taking some of the money from police and putting that into more social workers, more healthcare workers, more people that can do mental health checks without, it just happened recently where, in Canada, where someone was called to a mental health check and that person was killed or died. So when you talk about training, there's some training, but then also it's like, maybe the police for that particular, for whatever job they have, maybe it should be given to someone else who doesn't have a gun and a baton and a taser.
Especially with the mental health checks, right? Like, I mean, what's the worst you can do is you walk away, and if you could send in whatever they are, I mean, whatever you want to call them, a mental health worker, they go in, do a check. If it's escalated to violence, then, or it could potentially be violent, then you bring in somebody else, the next level. And then maybe if that doesn't work, the last level is to bring in the police.
Yeah. And why, when you talk about police, like levels, maybe it's a highly trained peace officer who, is able to restrain someone in a safe way, but doesn't have a gun and a taser. So, I don't want to say temptation, because I do believe that, that a majority of police do execute very good judgment, but then it's like, it's not even there. It's not even an option. If that mental health professional knows they don't have a weapon, it's like, well, bring in someone who's highly trained to de-escalate a situation and could restrain them and put them handcuffs if need be. Right?
More like a negotiator.
Exactly. Right. I mean, the issue is there's so many police services that don't focus on de-escalation, and that could solve, I don't want to throw out a percentage, but it's going to throw out, a lot of problems. But once again, it goes back to that systemic problem. It's how you hire your police officers, like you were saying. There's been so many examples of that. It's, you could spend 4 or 5 podcasts talking about it.
So Brian, what, I'm very white. What can somebody like me do to educate themselves more on, I guess, becoming more sensitive, being better informed? What would be some of your top things that somebody like me could do that's willing? Yeah, obviously, if somebody's not willing to make a change, they can't. But if for somebody who's interested in just becoming better, what can I do?
I mean, it starts with that realization that you need to know more. So, I mean, obviously, like, I give you a lot of credit for doing this and kind of reaching out to some people and reaching out to friends and family, kind of talk about that. But I would say, asking those questions and trying to, talk to your friends and family that are, of color or have experienced these things, and kind of just listen. I mean, I think the first step would be just to listen to people. And then the next step would be to learn. There's a lot of good books out there. Obviously I could tell you after the fact, after the interview, but there's a lot of books that kind of explain to some of these problems. Some of them are a little bit, there's a lot of information. When people are looking for kind of the explain it like I'm 5 or Cole's Notes version and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things you can read. The media is difficult because they try to sensationalize stuff, but listening to people experiences and just kind of gaining that empathy for people, I think that would be, the biggest thing you could do. And as a person who has some power, be very cognizant of, the decisions you're making moving forward. I briefly touched about hiring. There are so many things you can do when you're, say, hiring a new employee, to say, to get to that person to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to hire someone that's the best person for the job versus someone who I think, is going to be quote unquote the right fit. And what does that mean? Right. I mentioned before, like, getting resumes and getting someone to cover the names and seeing where that takes you. It's that experimentation and that openness to try different things. I mean, I was on a hiring panel once. This is a little example about the systemic racism. We narrowed it down to, a handful of people. And you had one candidate who was like a person of color, a woman. And it came down to this gentleman who was white. And she was an engineer, had an MBA, knew exactly what we were, what our product was and what we were doing. And then there was the other gentleman who had, some relevant experience, but had a high school education. Now he made it very, very far from himself, and he was a great candidate. He would have been a great candidate. But when you look at like the differences between the two resumes, it was pretty clear who was the better candidate. But everyone on the hiring panel wanted to pick him and said, I think he'd be a better fit.
Really?
And they couldn't define what that meant, a better fit. And I asked one, like, what do you mean? It's like, well, I think he could jump in here and get along with everyone real easy. And they didn't want to nail it down. And that's what you talked about before about, kind of that silent racism. And I'm not saying that they're racist by any means. They're really good people, but there's that unconscious gut feeling, I trust my gut all the time. It's like, well, your gut's telling you to hire someone who's completely less experienced, right?
Yeah.
Luckily, I had final say for this, and I did hire the person who I felt was the best, which was the person who was an engineer and MBA, and she was the best hire that I made, like, ever. So
yeah, that seems completely odd to me. Like, I have to do a lot of hiring for ours, and quite honestly, I rarely look at the name. I go through qualifications. And then once, if I get 10 resumes, I eliminate down to 5 based on qualifications. And then I do the interview, and it's based upon, like, at least what I do is it's based upon, what their experience is, what their education is. I mean, if anything, I actually almost go, I guess I flipped the switch the other way, because I don't really pay attention at all to the male, female, whatever. I've got so many guys coming in, and they come in with resumes completely unqualified, but they're big, they're ripped, they look like the trainer.
Yeah.
But you take a look at their education, and they're dumber than a doornail. I'm not having somebody in my, I don't care what color they are. If your education isn't there, or the qualifications I need, that's what I need first and foremost. Yeah. But I can't believe, in your situation, somebody who, if I had that situation, I'm not going to hire the person with one certification versus has a degree and a doctorate, right?
Yeah, and that's what I think a lot of the argument in the movement, in the community, the systemic racism, like, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about someone, when you hear this adage from parents, from Black parents, and someone like my mom who says, you have to work twice as hard. When you look at least in that one situation, that was a legitimate, like, she had to be 3 times as good as that person to get even a look at the job. Now, mind you, she made it all the way through to the final interview. So, I mean, there's something to be said for that. And like I said, I don't want to accuse anybody of being racist, because I don't think that was the thing. But when you talk about systemic racism, like, that's what it comes down to. You're hiring someone that looks like you. You're hiring someone that you feel is, quote unquote, the better fit, whatever you define that as being, right? Versus I want to hire the best person for the job. It's
just kind of a subconscious, I guess, racism in there. Like, this person doesn't look like me. And
I don't know if we're going to get along. What if our cultures clash? And what if she believes in something that I don't? That's the type of thing that's kind of churning in the back of your brain. And that's not, I mean, is it a bad thing? Yes, but it's something that could be untrained. So it's not hopeless. It's something that can be worked on. It's something that, if you're open to learning, you can easily fix that with some work, right? But I mean, that's the type of example I'm talking about, systemic racism. I mean, that's like, it's just completely, wow. You're hiring people that are the best fit for your job. You're hiring the best qualified candidate, and your staff is very diverse, and they're all professional and they're great, and it happens kind of naturally for you, but for other people it's not so natural.
And what's funny is basically no one would ever notice this, but my wife is part Syrian. Mm-hmm. And her mother is Syrian. She's not really that dark. Doesn't have a lot of the, I guess, classical features of, a Middle East person.
Yeah.
And my wife and her older brother look very much the same. Her younger brother, on the other hand, has a lot more of those Middle Eastern features, like, the nose, just the face shape. He's got darker skin. Quite honestly, it's almost a little hard to believe that they're brother and sister, but
yeah,
you never know what the person's going to look like. In fact, I read something by this one lady. She posted that her and her husband are black, but she gets a lot more racist comments and negative attitudes towards her because she's very dark. Now, I saw a picture of her husband, and he's very, very, he honestly looks like a white guy with really decent tan, but both of his parents are black. And she said even the difference, this was I think I found it on Facebook or Instagram, and even the just difference between those two, even though he's black, she's black, just the slightly different shade of skin has an impact as well.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's what going back to the first part of the conversation. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Is it becomes like it's like you're judging someone literally on how much melanin they have in their skin. Like they have the same values. They're raised by the same people. It's the same everything, but it's the color of skin. But that's how some people try to do the us versus them. That's how that's how you divide people, and it's really easy to do. It's really easy to do. And it's a shame. But people have to work at it. People have to work on breaking down those thoughts and opinions with themselves and with others. Right. And, it starts with conversations.
Thank you, Brian, for joining us on the podcast today. Really enjoyed the talk, and hopefully everybody out there listening learned something. Educate yourself a little bit more. Even if you think you're the best educated person on this subject, there's always room for change. Thanks, guys, for listening. Please share this podcast and make sure you subscribed, because a bunch of you are listening haven't passed it on to your friends. Find me on social media at MikeClarkLife on all major platforms, or visit MikeClarkLife.com.